see is you. Former shadows fading, every shade of blue, shapes are rearranging, yeah, everything is changing. Took a load, took a load, took a load of me. Took a load, took a load, took a load of me. It took a load, took a load, took a load of me. Took a load, took a load, took a load of me. You chasing night, all hopes are high, looking for the chance of romance. Under the lights, you touch the sky, all of heaven starts to watch you dance. One shot and I give my all, two hearts that become whole. Three words that mean it all, you catch me when I fall. One shot and I give my all, two hearts that become whole. Three words that mean it all, you catch me when I fall. When we're not sleeping, this is my dream. You mean everything to me, you mean everything to me. Midnight's a big creeping, but I thought I'd scream. Would you be my dancing queen? Would you be my ecstasy? You chasing night, all hopes are high, looking for the chance of romance. Oh, out of sight, to watch you fly, left me burning on the getaway. One shot and I give my all, two hearts that become whole. Three words that mean it all, you catch me when I fall. One shot and I give my all, two hearts that become whole. Three words that mean it all, you catch me when I fall. When we're not sleeping, this is my dream. You mean everything to me, you mean everything to me. Midnight's a big creeping, but I thought I'd scream. Would you be my dancing queen? Would you be my ecstasy? train out of New Mexico, looking for a flame, pull my heart off cold. So might knock on lands to get out of town. Don't know how deep you're in till you're trying to get out. She was floating like a vision down through the aisle. Mississippi queen with a Tennessee smile. The smell of cheap coffee and Jamaican rum. We watched the desert fade in the Santa Fe sun. I said I'm not feeling right. She said, well, you'll be just fine. Go ahead and rest your eyes, 'cause you can't look back. You can't look back. There ain't no future in the past, and you can't look back. With characters galore in the shy you lead the sun. Pineapple store with the senoritas. All the disenfranchised kids in the room. We were baptized in the Pacific moon. Someone put a cactus up to my tongue. You can feel alive and try calling it love. The boy with a smile handed me his keys. Said go ahead and try, but you'll never leave. Someone was singing a hymn and the room started to spin. So I jumped right in, singing can't look back. You can't look back. There ain't no future in the past, and you can't look back. Planned. I had missed a flight out of Birmingham. Way her yellow hair and walked in the moon. There was no mistake in the way that she moved. This is my boy and this is my girl. And I'll be employed till the end of the world. Somewhere tonight on the westbound train. You know there's wild hearts just running away. Sounded just like a dream. Once she's still singing to me. It was so bittersweet because you can't look back. You can't look back. There ain't no future in the past, and you can't go back. You can't look back. You can't go back. There ain't no future in the past, and you can't look back. If you wanna roll me, then you gotta roll me all night long. And if you wanna use me, then you gotta use me till I'm gone. I'm not a fallen angel, I just fell behind. I'm out of luck and I'm out of time. If you don't wanna love me, let me go. I'm running for the last train. I'm running for the last train home.
Well, g'day. I'm Charles. I'm one of the pastors here at Grace City, and I want to welcome you here tonight, whether you're in person or whether you are tuning in online. Summer Nights is an opportunity for us to explore the interaction between culture and Christianity in a way that neither retreats from our culture nor is taken captive by it. And for those who think into these things, what they'll notice is a culture will go through a shift and a transition every generation or two. Sometimes that's an evolution, sometimes it's a revolution. And those changes will bring with it an upturning of values and beliefs and habits. It's almost like two tectonic plates meeting, and as that happens, there'll be fault lines that form. Now, our guest tonight is Dr. Stephen Chavura, and he is the senior lecturer in history at Campion College. He's written a number of books, kind of particularly pressing into the relationship between religion and secularism, particularly in our Australian history. He also kind of has engaged in public discourse in kind of newspapers and other kind of public forums. But Stephen has an ability to spot the fault lines that are forming as our culture is shifting and changing, and an ability to ask the hard questions that are being thrown up through those processes. And in particular, he makes us notice, causes us to notice things in our own history, in our own past, sometimes things we've forgotten, sometimes things we've misunderstood. Now, tonight, what we're going to hear is going to be thought-provoking. You may even find it controversial. You might even disagree with things sometimes. And so I want to invite you to think. I want to invite you to reflect, to ask, why do I think what I think, and then ask questions? Because it's actually through a process of conversation where we listen to each other that we can actually learn and grow together. For that reason, we're going to do a Q&A together. So after Stephen speaks, we're going to have about 20 minutes or so. And so you can scan that QR code there. It'll take you through to an app where you can submit your questions. You can get that now. That QR code will also come up when we go to our Q&A time. But for now, let me welcome Dr. Stephen Chavura.
Oh, it's really great to be here. Thanks for the invitation again, Charles. And I was just saying, it's such a beautiful building. I'm really impressed with what you've got going on here. I hope I say something that's sort of interesting to you all. As Charles said, I sort of am a historian by trade, teaching Australian history, ancient history, early modern European history at Campion College, which is in Old Toongabbie. And one thing I've been interested in for many years is explaining why culture changes. And I'll give you an example of exactly what I'm talking about. And so we'll mainly be taking the conversation from the 1960s to the present day, or what many people are sort of calling the Great Awakening. That is sort of wokeness, sort of radicalism creeping into just popular culture, advertising, corporations, certainly universities and things like that. Where does it all come from? Well, I'll try and answer a little bit of that tonight. So, can anyone tell me what this is a picture of? I know some of you will know it. Very good. That's excellent. I mean, I would almost think there are some Anglicans here, but this is good. This is a picture of the Melbourne Cricket Ground in 1959 when Billy Graham, the very famous American evangelist and preacher, came and preached actually for 3 months around Australasia. And he packed out auditoriums, sports grounds around the Australasia region for 3 months. And this is a crowd of about 120 to 130,000 people. Probably the largest crowd that's ever assembled at the Melbourne Cricket Ground. Certainly the largest crowd for a non-sporting event. Just the following year in Victoria, a report on Victorian education was released called the Ramsay Report. And the question of this report was, what do we want to teach kids in Victoria? What do we want them to know? And this is 1960, and one of the things that they thought kids need to know is that they need to understand the beliefs and teaching of Christianity. Now, this isn't in religious schools, this is public schools in Victoria. The other thing is that they want to develop the kind of character that is conducive to our religious heritage. Again, talking about Christianity. Now, some of you are probably thinking, oh my goodness, Victoria, really? Yes, as one person famously said once, the past is a foreign country. We're dealing with a very different Australia in the late 1950s and 1960. To give you an example, now the question is being asked whether religion should be allowed in schools at all. So these were headlines that were circulating around during sort of 2017, 18, 19 about whether Christianity should be taught in schools, and many said that it should not. Why? Because it's harmful. And so the point that I'm making is that we've gone from literally probably, certainly hundreds of thousands, probably millions of Australians going to see Billy Graham, the Victorian public school curriculum wanting to include Christian teaching for all the kids, to, well, we shouldn't have Christianity in schools anymore because it's dangerous and harmful. And so what the historian asks is, how did that cultural change happen? Because that is, to use a word that Charles used earlier, that is actually what we might call a cultural revolution. A cultural revolution which takes place roughly over about 50 to 60 years. And so I want to start here in the 1950s. Now, some of you might recognize, well, at least I know that a lot of you will recognize that picture at the top left, because many of you would have heard of James Dean, the famous Hollywood actor. Many people in the 1940s and 50s were noticing something about the youth. What they were noticing was that the youth seemed anxious. The youth seemed to be cynical in the 50s and 60s, particularly, in the 40s and 50s. And the youth seemed to be caring less about sort of established authorities like parental authority, governmental authorities, and other kinds of authorities, the authorities of teachers. And so a film was actually made about it called Rebel Without a Cause. Has anyone here heard of that movie, Rebel Without a Cause? Well, I mean, that title actually, believe it or not, it's not just a cool title. The title itself is actually referring to a question that sociologists were asking in the 1950s. The kids seem really anxious and rebellious, but why? Because this is the post-World War II generation. They inherited the best living conditions in human history. We're talking right now about very early, what you might call a baby boomer generation, born from about 1945 onwards. They inherited a peaceful world. They inherited, particularly in America and Australia, immense economic prosperity. And they inherited all sorts of life opportunities that their parents and grandparents could only dream of. And so, in actual fact, they enjoyed the best living conditions really in human history. And yet, they seemed to be, many of them seemed to be dissatisfied. And many people are asking why. This was also taking place in Australia. So here's a magazine from 1963 in Australia called Oz Magazine. Some of you here might even remember Oz Magazine, I think. But Oz Magazine was a magazine started in the earlier 1960s in Australia, and it was a magazine that basically wanted to rebel against, pillory, make fun of every established authority in Australia, whether it was the churches, whether it was the mainstream media, whether it was the politicians, whether it was the celebrities. It was a very cynical and sort of comedic magazine. The point is that in the 1950s and and certainly in the 1960s, a sort of a feeling of disaffection, alienation, anxiety is emerging among the youth. Now, exactly why it's happening, historians are not entirely sure. Many people at the time, and this is probably quite plausible, argued that it's probably because of prosperity. That is, that the more prosperous a society is, the more people's minds can wander to things other than just day-to-day survival, and they actually start worrying about a whole bunch of other things. So, for example, if you were born 700 years ago, you don't get to sort of the age of 15 and ask, what am I going to do with my life? You know what you're going to do with your life. If you're a woman, you're going to start having children pretty soon. and you probably won't live that long either, because you'll die in childbirth at some point. And if you're a man, if you're a boy, you know what you're going to do. You're going to do basically what your father did. If he was some sort of a tradesperson or an artisan, you will do his trade. More likely, you're probably basically going to eke a living off the land, subsistence labor, and again, you will work your fingers to the bone until you die. The question of what am I going to do with my life is a question that arises in a very modern, prosperous society, and the anxiety that many of the youth have, who am I? What am I going to do with my life? That is an anxiety that is a luxury of modern society for the most part. And so many historians say that with immense prosperity after World War II, a kind of anxiety and even cynicism emerged about society. That's not even a new idea. Livy, the ancient Roman historian, said the same thing when he was writing his history of Rome over the period of the first centuries BC and AD. So it's an old idea that sort of prosperity and sort of corrupts. It's very interesting. Something else starts happening, particularly in the 1960s. So remember, where am I going with this? I'm trying to explain how Australia and how also much of the West basically turned out to be as it is today. So a process starts taking place in the 1960s, which many historians and sociologists call secularization. Now, I'm actually not a big fan of the word secularization because it almost suggests that religion declines. But I'm a bit of a fan of what the Apostle Paul says in the book of Romans, where he says that although people know that God exists, they sort of push him out of their minds and they start worshipping other things. So they don't when they decide to abandon the worship of the true God, they don't suddenly become religionless, says the Apostle Paul. They don't. In fact, they just adopt other religions and sort of forms of paganism or what have you. So I often use the term secularization, but I prefer the term de-Christianization myself, because I'm skeptical that people today are any less religious than they were 70 years ago. I think that natural religious impulse in all human beings has just found other avenues through which to flow. So people are into yoga. People are into all sorts of new age lifestyles. People are into sort of just worshipping their body. But people are also buying into social justice ideologies as well. So here's a controversial statement. Probably Black Lives Matter functions in the lives of a lot of people in the same way that evangelical Christianity once functioned in a lot of people's lives. It's kind of almost a religious commitment with its own forms of ceremony and that sort of thing. So let's talk a bit more specifically about the decline of church-going. That might be more helpful. Why does church-going decline? Probably in round about 1960, the percentage of Australians that went to church every week, it was probably somewhere around about 30 to 35%. Nowadays, I suspect it's probably around about 5%. So that's a pretty big drop. In the year 1900, there was a census done, and about 96% of Australians identified as Christian. We're waiting now on the 2020 census. It may well dip below 50%. And there's been a great decline in church-going. Why did that happen? Why was there a decline of church-going? Well, in actual fact, many of the answers to that question are actually things that are actually quite mundane. For example, the introduction of the family car. So in the 1960s, more and more families started to own their own car. You might think to yourself, why would that affect church going? Doesn't that make it easier to go to church? Well, I guess it does, but it also makes it easier on a Sunday to take a drive up or down the coast, to get away from the neighborhood. And you've got to remember that on Sundays, there isn't really much else to do other than church. And so a lot of people probably went to church basically just to meet up with people and for something to do. You've got to remember that there weren't really Sunday sports, shops weren't even open. There was basically no public transport on Sundays, or it was it ran very, very sparsely. So with the introduction of the car, even ministers at the time, and I've got a quote there, said that with the introduction of the car, people started dropping off from going to church. They took the car and went elsewhere. They did other things. Another thing that really interrupted church going was the introduction of television. So again, television provides an alternative to church. Other things start to become introduced as well on Sundays, like Sunday sports and things like that. And a lot of this starts to bring people away from regular church attendance. So if you were going maybe once a fortnight, you might start becoming a once a monther or a once every 6 weeks. If you're a once a monther, you become once every few months. If you're once every few months, you become Christmas and Easter. So that's what, and it's interesting how culturally speaking, some of the seemingly most insignificant things can have a massive impact. So one of the things that's almost certainly had a big impact on the size of families in Australia and elsewhere around the world, some of you might guess, but the introduction of compulsory seatbelt wearing in cars. Now you might be thinking, how could that have an impact on the size of a family? Well, some of you might remember that back in the 1950s and 60s and even in the early 70s, you could basically pile as many people into a car as you could, and it was basically legal, which meant that if you wanted to have a fourth kid or a fifth kid or even a sixth kid, if you could basically fit them in that car, you could do it, and you wouldn't have to upgrade to another car. So having more children didn't necessarily become a massive source of expense. But when compulsory seatbelts were introduced, what that meant was basically you could only have 3 or 4 kids. And if you had more than that, then basically you had to buy a whole new car. It was a big expense. So a lot of people just said, well, we'll stop at 3. So the point that I'm making is one of the things that actually changes and drives culture is technological changes that often you wouldn't think would have other types of effects, but they do. I'll come to another huge one in a second. Now, another thing that starts taking place around about this time in the 1960s is that many churches start thinking that they need to sort of keep up with the modern sort of isms, the modern philosophies of the times. Now, I know that David Robertson spoke to you maybe last week or a few weeks ago on different philosophies that are sort of floating around out there. One thing that happens in the 1960s especially is that churches start seeing that culture is changing. Belief in God is declining a little bit. People's morals are changing and they're moving a little bit away from the Bible. And so some people start saying, well, if Christianity is to remain relevant, then it needs to change with the times. And Christians need to change their teachings on things like sexual ethics. They need to change their teachings on things like who God is, the authority of the Bible, and things like that. And so that's another change that's taking place. And I have to say that pretty much all the churches that went down the path of let's change with culture so we remain relevant, they all basically started to die from that period. And their numbers even to this day are quite low. It's the churches that actually resisted that and remained pretty staunch in their convictions, biblical, moral, that wound up surviving the most successfully. That's a whole talk for another time. Now, what is going on? Also, during the period of the 1960s, while church attendance in Australia, in America, and around Europe is declining, that means that a lot of people are not hearing the messages that you would hear in church of a Sunday, the messages about who God is, salvation through Christ, moral teachings. So they're not hearing these messages on Sundays, but nature abhors a vacuum. Something else is going to come in and fill that void. And what comes in? Well, basically a lot of popular music and a lot of popular television programs start preaching alternative messages. And if you want to understand the 1960s, you cannot understand it without understanding how huge and important the Beatles were. The Beatles were just one of the most significant cultural forces of the 20th century. You just cannot exaggerate how influential they were. They had an impact on the way young people dressed. They had an impact on the way young people thought. They helped to popularize New Age and Eastern mysticism in the West. They did a whole bunch of things that left their mark on culture sort of permanently. And very famously, John Lennon once said that basically the Beatles are bigger than Jesus. Now, he tried to deny that he said it, but he did say it. And it's a very John Lennon thing to say as well, if you sort of learn a little bit about John Lennon. John Lennon is an interesting fellow because John Lennon was no fool. He was a very, very intelligent man, and he had come into contact with all sorts of radical philosophies when he was a young man playing the clubs in Germany, in Hamburg. And he came into contact with atheistic philosophies. One of them is called existentialism. Basically the idea that the only significant thing that exists is you and your will to express your will in the world. It's a very, very individualistic, generally atheistic philosophy. I have actually a good friend who shared a desk with John Lennon at school. And my friend said that even in sort of younger high school, John Lennon was into really radical, weird philosophies. So that's pretty interesting. And so the Beatles were sort of pumping all these messages into sort of people's minds. And here's one of them. This was a solo song from John Lennon, but you've all heard the song Imagine. I don't know, though, but maybe some of you might not know. Did David Robertson mention a philosophy called Marxism? Well, you're going to hear a bit about Marxism when Rob Smith comes. But when you read the lyrics of his song Imagine, which is, of course, one of the anthems of the later 20th century, it's basically a Marxist communist anthem. Because what he's basically saying is, wouldn't the world be really hunky-dory if there was no property, so imagine no possessions, if there were no national borders, imagine no countries, if there was no religion, imagine no heaven, imagine no hell, imagine no religion too, imagine everyone living in peace. It's basically a Marxist anthem. So as Christianity and church-going seems socially to be declining from the 60s, other messages influenced by other philosophies are being sort of poured into the minds of the young, if you like. Now, something that happens in the mid-1960s really accelerates a lot of this disaffection and cynicism about prevailing authorities and sort of takes the angst of the 50s and 60s and makes it quite radical and almost militant. It turns it into a sort of like, oh, those authorities, what do they know? I don't need to listen to them, to something more like, these authorities are oppressive and they all need to be overthrown. It radicalizes the anxiety and cynicism of the 50s and 60s. And does anyone know what event I'm talking about?
Vietnam War.
Good man, the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, particularly with the introduction of conscription in the mid-1960s. The Vietnam War was seen as an incredibly unjust war by the youth. It was in a country where most people couldn't even find it on a map, about issues that most people thought did not concern them. Why are our young men being sent over there to be killed? If you want to sort of get a glimpse of it, watch the film Forrest Gump. Most of you have probably seen it. That deals with that kind of thing. And the Vietnam War really made plausible and popular quite radical philosophical ideas that basically said that all the institutions, all the ways of thinking that we've been brought up to appreciate, that they're all not just corrupt, but they are incredibly oppressive. And what you need to do is you need to overthrow them. And one way to overthrow them is basically by getting into institutions, particularly schools and universities, and teaching people radically different things. Teach them radically different things about economics. Teach them radically different things about race relations, about gender relations, and that sort of thing. Now, again, Rob Smith is going to talk to you about that when he comes, so I'm not going to say anything more about that. But what we've seen so far in terms of how culture changed was that, technological innovations led to different social practices. We've seen the introduction of new ideologies coming in through popular music, which is also informing the minds of the young people. We've seen the decline in church attendance, partly because of technological advances. But the other thing is that this all sort of takes on a kind of life of its own. And as we're going to see, what starts to happen, particularly in the 1960s, and this is actually incredibly important, maybe it's the most important point, that there starts to be a separation between biblical Christianity and the way that people think life should be lived, the good life. So, up until, you might say, the 1960s even, Christianity's teachings on basically all things, whether it's property, whether it's morality, but particularly I would say sexual morality, are basically considered by most people to be good and true and right and kind of common sense. So if you like sort of Venn diagrams, that basically Christian morality and sort of the wider sort of social way of thinking about how we should live kind of coincided with one another. But what starts happening with the 1960s, particularly in light of the things I've been talking about and something else I'm about to talk about now, these things start to come apart. They start to come apart to the point where we sort of are today, where they're almost like that, and sort of prevailing public views of what the good life is, what is moral, what gender is, what good sort of sexual ethics are, seem almost so foreign from biblical Christianity that biblical Christianity doesn't just look strange, it actually looks positively hostile. It actually looks dangerous. So sort of how did that happen? And central to that, that's actually, I'll go back, I'll show you that picture. That's a picture of Sydney University. Some of you may have gone to Sydney University or be at Sydney University. That's a photograph from 1973. Students rallying to have feminism introduced into the philosophy course, which is actually a little hint as to sort of the big trend that starts really taking place in the 1950s, and it's what we call the sexual revolution. The sexual revolution. Now, look at this glorious picture. I was showing this to a group of sort of 18-year-olds just the other day, and look at this. It's a beautiful thing to behold. Everyone doing what they should be doing, and everyone just happy. You've got the men there basically playing a game where they're basically trying to kill one another, and then you've got the ladies in the background basking in not just the company of those men, but basking in their duties as women, washing those dishes. And you might not be able to see it, but they've got huge smiles on their faces. They look at those men and just say to themselves, everything right now is as it should be. It's a beautiful thing. Now, you're all laughing like this is some sort of joke. So what the historian wants to ask then is, something, this picture, which to me looks late 1950s, no one in the late 1950s was laughing at that picture. You guys are laughing at it. So I want to know then what historically has happened so that where once upon a time people didn't laugh at it, now we do. How did that happen? Because the fact that people here are laughing at that picture, I'm not necessarily saying you're mocking it, don't worry. But the fact that we sort of see this with a kind of ironic humor, that itself, the way we see this, is a product of history. And this is the thing I try to impress on my students, that we are historical creatures. We are not just biological creatures. We are not just psychological creatures. We are not just even creatures with eternal souls, if you like. We are historical creatures. And so much of who we are as individuals is something that is a product of history. And I guess in a way, I'm trying to sort of show sort of exactly how we became who we are today historically. And the sexual revolution is essentially a process that takes place roughly from the 1960s throughout the 1970s, where the way we think about gender relations, how men and women relate to one another, the way we think about, I suppose, social relations of the sexes, what women should do in society, what men should do in society, and also the way we think about sexual ethics and sexual relations starts to really quite rapidly and radically change. And there's a whole history behind this, which I won't go into, but one thing I will mention, because all historians see it as basically central, is the introduction of the contraceptive pill in 1960. In 1960, cheap and effective contraception is introduced for women, which pretty much for the first time in history gives women a very, very powerful ability to be able to control their reproductive history. Now, you have to understand that, again, prior to the introduction of the pill, if you were a woman, sort of what you were going to do with your life was kind of given. It was kind of a question that was sort of, the answer was really linked to your biology as a woman. Well, at some point you're going to want to get married, and the inevitable result of that is that you will have children. Unless it's a celibate marriage, which it almost certainly won't be, you're going to have children. And so the question of what a woman would do with her life was not as open-ended as it is today. But with the introduction of the pill in 1960, that becomes, over time, a much more open issue. Well, you know, you don't have to, as a woman, have children straight away. You can pursue a career. So the idea of the career woman starts to emerge, particularly strongly in the 1970s. And so contraception really changes the way that we think about a woman's place in society. It's no longer sort of seen to a large extent as domestic, although we've got to be careful about caricaturing the past. Women were always actually very active in the communities in the past, particularly Christian church-going women. They were very active in the community. Goodness sakes, they won South Australian women the vote in 1896, the second region in the world to get the vote for women, just after New Zealand. So that's pretty impressive. So women weren't just sort of in the home, but the general understanding of a woman's role was that she is the homemaker, and she is the prime sort of influence in raising the next generation. It was quite domestic. That changes with the pill over the next 20 years. Another thing that changes with the pill is our understanding of sexual ethics. You see, like I said earlier, Christian ethics was kind of seen as a bit of common sense. Well, of course you're not going to have sex outside of marriage because that leads to children, and you don't want to have children out of wedlock because that's not a healthy, stable economic environment to raise children. You know, you want the mother and the father, and the institution that we came up with to sort of manage that is called marriage. But with the pill, suddenly, sexual activity can become purely recreational. It doesn't have to result in life, which means the Christian idea of saving sex for marriage, for a lot of people, starts to seem a bit old-fashioned and a bit irrelevant. Why do that? We're not going to have kids. Why can't we just have sex with whomever we want and not think twice about it? And so the free love movement of the 1960s becomes possible because of contraception. The other thing that the sexual revolution really challenges is the biblical view of proper sexual morality being sex between a man and a woman within marriage, the man and woman part. And so if people are starting to say, well, we don't need to worry about the monogamy within marriage bit, we can just do whatever we want. And other people start saying, well, okay, if we're not going to worry about that bit anymore, what other things can we sort of throw out? What other things might be a little bit old hat? And again, in the 1960s and especially in the 1970s, and it really sort of comes to sort of a head in the 1990s probably, is the gay rights movement. So the sexual revolution doesn't just change the way we think about heterosexual sexual morality. It changes the way we think about homosexuality as well. There's obviously a pretty famous person. He might not be as famous today as he was once, but that's David Bowie on the cover of a record that came out probably in the early 1970s, and he's dressed as a woman. And so in the 1970s, you start to get all this gender bending stuff going on as well. People experimenting, men wearing clothes of women and vice versa and that kind of thing. So this is all sort of happening, particularly in the 1970s. And often these trends hit Australia about 10 years later. Australia usually is about 10 years behind America when it comes to trends. But this is a photograph of the first Sydney Gay Mardi Gras in 1978. So the sexual revolution, again, further pushes that separation that I've been talking to you about between Christian or biblical morality, as I prefer to call it, and the way just every sort of any person on the street starts to think about morality. They start to come apart a bit more. And like I said, the more these start to come apart, the further they are prized from one another, the more they start to see one another as actually immoral. And what I want to say is that, in the 1960s and 70s, Christian sexual morality was kind of seen as a little bit it's kind of old-fashioned. Okay, if you want to live that way, you can, but it's kind of old-fashioned. We can do whatever we want these days. Whereas nowadays, because we've moved so much further away from Christianity, it's not just seen as old-fashioned, it's seen as positively immoral. The idea that proper sexual morality is really just sexual activity between a husband and a wife. That idea nowadays by a lot of people is not seen as just that's old-fashioned. It's actually seen as positively immoral, and even it is seen as harmful. That is something that's actually socially harmful. That could lead people, it could really damage people's self-esteem and that sort of thing. And boy, in a sense, the same-sex marriage debate that we recently had was really the upshot of everything I've been talking to you all about. Prior to, the introduction of the pill, when people sort of thought about marriage, they understood marriage to be basically an institution whose main purpose was to provide a sort of safe institution for the raising of children. That is, the meaning of marriage was something that was linked to our biology as human beings. It was a natural institution. Why get married? Well, let me be blunt. Why get married? Well, because I want to have sex. And if I'm going to have sex, then I'm going to make children, and I've got to do something with those children. And there's the sets of rules that basically keep me looking after those children, paying for those children, keeping the mother, off the streets. That set of institutions is called marriage. That set of rules is called marriage. I'm being very, very sort of harsh and unromantic about it, but that is one actual fact of marriage. So the idea, this is the very important point. In the 1950s, prior to sort of contraception or sort of cheap and effective contraception, the idea of a man marrying a man, it's not that people would have thought it was immoral, or a woman marrying a woman. It's not that they would have thought it was immoral. They would have thought it makes no sense. Why would a man marry a man when a man can't make a baby with a man? So how did we get to a point where same-sex marriage makes sense? Well, because we untethered sex from children, which meant that marriage over time stopped being about, a proper institution for the raising of children and became more about an expression of one person's love for another person. It became less about the biological aspect of who we are as human beings, less about the creation of life, and more about the expression of our feelings for one another. And when marriage becomes redefined as basically an expression to the effect that, you're my number one and I'm your number one, then in actual fact, the idea of two men getting married or two women getting married can make sense, because the meaning of marriage changes to basically an emotional expression. And why does it change? Well, for the reasons I've been trying to outline sort of for the last half hour. For all of those reasons, the decline of Christian beliefs of morality, the effects of of contraception on our sexual practices and the way that we think and those sorts of things. So one Australian historian, David Hilliard, really captures the essence of the 60s that I've been talking about. And he says that at the center of the 60s was a rebellion by the young against the values, conventions, and authorities of the older generation, and the emergence of a new cultural style, the expressive revolution. That is, what do we mean by the expressive revolution? We basically mean that the good life is being true to yourself. The good life is when you are doing you. That's an expression, you do you. And hear people say, don't change me. I'm not going to change for anyone. This is who I am. Well, maybe you're a jerk. Maybe you should change. Or maybe who you are is actually quite self-destructive. And your big problem is actually not that people are trying to change you, but that you're not changing. That's your big problem. Gosh, I sound like Jordan Peterson now, but he's basically right. And so this sort of self-expressive revolution basically starts defining what a life well lived is basically a life where you truly express who you are. So if on your birth certificate it says boy, but in actual fact you feel like a girl, well, something, you do you be a girl, because that's who you want to be. That's who you are deep down. Don't worry about what those authorities say. Don't worry about what the doctors say. They're all brainwashed by sort of gender binary ideologies that really serve to oppress people like you. So don't listen to them. We've actually got to overthrow that way of thinking because it's oppressive, and you need to be liberated from it. And that's what the whole transgender movement is to a large extent about. It's about liberating people from what they would deem to be oppressive ideas, like there is only male and female. There's nothing in between, really, for the most part, other than some obvious sort of biological complications that some people can be born with. And again, this is very much a lot of this is very much a product of the 60s that we've been talking about. There's an awful lot more to it, and in a sense, we are kind of living in this self-expressive revolution that has taken place. A great example of it, of sort of a change that has taken place in the way that we think, is in the brouhaha around J.K. Rowling, as she said a few years ago. And here are the tweets where J.K. Rowling said, look, if you want to call yourself, talking to sort of biological men, if I can use that expression, if you want to call yourselves women, if you want to dress like a woman, be my guest. I don't care. God bless you. Do what you want. But don't demand that women believe you. Don't demand that they change their lives to suit you. Don't make it so that your choice has an impact on them and the spaces that they're allowed to be in. That's what she said. Wow, I mean, that caused a storm. But the interesting thing about this storm was the different philosophical presuppositions that were brought to this. So J.K. Rowling says if sex isn't real, then there's no same-sex attraction, if sex isn't real. So she keeps coming back to this concept of reality, that there is a brute reality out there that is really real, whether you like it or not. You can jump off a cliff and scream that gravity doesn't really exist. It makes no difference. It is real, and you're going to feel it very, very soon. That is sort of the traditional modernist worldview, that there is a reality out there, science tells us about it, and there's just no getting around it. It's objectivity. Whereas nowadays, a kind of postmodern way of thinking has crept in a lot more, and it's kind of more to the idea that, well, you know something, the real question of what is true and what is real is, in a sense, something that you decide as an individual. Now that sounds very strange, but you hear it in our language all the time. So people have stopped saying, oh, you know something, I think, in fact, that X, Y, Z. What do they say now? They don't say I think anymore. What do they say? They say I feel. So I feel that Weber's definition of the state is a bit too narrow for me. No, you don't feel that. You feel cold, you feel bored. You don't feel that Weber's definition of the state is narrow. You think that. So we've sort of confused thinking with feeling. We've sort of made everything subjective. So you hear people also say, well, you know, that's your truth. What's your truth? This is my truth. And there's sort of other examples of it as well. So Emma Watson comes along and says, trans people are who they say they are. Full stop. Trans people are who they say they are. It almost makes gods of us. What do I mean by that? How did God bring everything into existence? What did he use? Yeah, he spoke. He spoke words. And with this sort of new, sort of postmodern, self-expressive idea, it's kind of the same thing. If I say I'm a man, or if I say I'm a woman, if I say I'm neither, then that is what dictates reality. We almost sort of arrogate from God a creative power that humans never had to begin with. It's a total inversion of the creation-creator distinction that's going on. Gosh, like I said, we could go for hours, but I really have to sort of finish up pretty soon. Now, I do actually want to end on a note of not just hope, but actually on a note of promise and triumph. Because here's the thing. God doesn't reveal to us how we ought to think about ourselves as creatures, as human creatures, as male and female. And he doesn't reveal to us moral principles because he wants us to be miserable. He reveals these things to us in the Bible because in understanding them and acting accordingly, we will actually live much better lives. Which means that the more that culture departs from the biblical model of how we ought to live and how we ought to think of ourselves in terms of our gender and sexual morality, then what must happen is that the way that we think about ourselves and the way that we live increasingly becomes sort of untethered from the nature that God gave us. And it will lead over time to all sorts of social problems. It'll lead to what some people call immiserization over time. That it's not going to make people over the long period, it's not going to make society over the long period happy. It's actually going to lead to misery, if you like. I think that is a plausible lesson that we can take from the Bible, which means that creates a tremendous opportunity for Christians who are living faithfully to the Bible's teachings to actually be a beacon of light to a world that is becoming darker and darker. And this is the thing, that as the world becomes darker, the light for those who are looking for it becomes brighter. And that's precisely what happened in the early church. The early church comes at a period in Roman history where it's just the pits. It's a disgusting, pagan, carnal, saturated culture. And the Christians come along, and not everyone gravitates to Christianity. I'm not giving any false promises here. It's never going to convince, you're never going to convince everyone. But you're always going to convince some, because there are always some who are going to be looking for the purity, they're going to be looking for the truth, they're going to be looking for the way. And that's precisely what happened with the early Christians. They themselves created a cultural revolution in the Roman Empire, because they had what people were craving: light, truth, purity. And like I said, this is not just hope, this is actually a promise that we get from Scripture, from Matthew chapter 5. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled by men. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. Let your light shine among men so they will see your good deeds and they will praise your Father in heaven. That is, that Christians living faithfully to Scripture, Christians' lives exemplifying the reality of the risen Christ, their lives individually, their lives as families, and their lives corporately as a church, that will attract people looking for truth, beauty, goodness, purity. They will see you and they will give praise to our Father in heaven. That is a promise. So that's a pretty good way to end on what otherwise would be a pretty dismal presentation. But I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for that. Thank you for just laying out the history, the story of our culture so clearly. Why don't you come up, Maddie?
Very incompletely, though, I have to say, but there's so much to it.
And one of the things I find it's always interesting with history. It's easy for somebody to tell their own version of history when the details aren't there.
Yes.
So thank you for taking us through the details.
I found, I've been sort of trying to figure this out for over a decade, and I was shocked finding the details as I went along, reading very old books, reading diaries, reading all sorts of things and putting the pieces together and just realizing, wow, reality always is much more interesting than fiction.
Well, if you've got questions, you can send those in, so that QR code will take you through and we'll be able to see those questions there. But I just had a question to kick us off as people have a moment to do that. In terms of history, it's interesting that at the moment our culture seems to be actually revising our own history, kind of often understood in terms of a story of kind of oppression. To what extent do you think we need to, in a sense, reclaim, appreciate our own history, yet also take full stock of the critiques of our own history and the problems that are there?
Yeah, it's a great question. This is something that I realise that Christians cannot write their own history as Christians as though we're perfect, because part of being a Christian is to know that we're not perfect, is to know that we're sinful. There's something about a Christian understanding of history which makes it impossible for Christians to sort of purify our own past. But I mean, when you're talking about history, the thing that you really want is truth. And part of the modern emphasis on a lot of the bad things that have happened in the past, whether it's to racial minorities, whether it's to sexual minorities, whether it's to women, I think some of it can be exaggerated. I think some of it is if it's exaggerated, not that much. But part of it is that because, well, for a long time, a lot of these histories were sort of ignored. And so, in Australia, for example, I mean, we're all aware that some pretty horrible things happened to Indigenous Australians, diseases that they caught. There most certainly were massacres and other sorts of things that befell them. Now, once upon a time, that was pretty much ignored when you studied the history of Australia. It was what we call the Three Cheers view of Australia. Basically, everything is hunky-dory. And the problem is that the modern emphasis on Australian history is just one horrific event after another, is an overcorrection. And history is actually much more interesting. It's very often the history of good intentions that didn't turn out the way we wanted them to. But that's not unique to Australia. That's all national histories. But one thing that we want to be careful, again, this is one thing I will say as Christians, and I actually do think that a Christian view of history must involve the belief that Christianity overall actually makes a more positive than negative impact on history. So that is something I actually will boldly declare, that as a Christian, and I can take it as a faith position at first, but basically the influence of Christianity in history is much more for good than it is for ill. And I would actually happily back that up as well. But I do actually think, so at that point, Christians actually need to be careful about too easily accepting histories of the past, particularly in the Christian worlds, that basically describe it as one atrocity after another with hardly anything good coming from Christians. No, I'm sorry, but if the Holy Spirit, if he is moving in history, if at least he moves in individual Christians in history, there must be a net positive effect. And I actually think that is historically demonstrable. I really do. I can't go into that tonight, though.
A book like Dominion by Tom Holland, I think, is a good place to start with that.
That's great. And Dominion by Tom Holland, it's already a classic. How Christianity Changed the World by Alvin Schmidt is a bit more popular, but that's a very good book. But yeah, Dominion by Tom Holland, great book. Great book.
I've got a couple of questions here that essentially want you to forget your training as a historian and engage in a little act of prophecy.
Sure.
So,
as long as you don't stone me. Yeah.
Will the next I'll ask two questions. Will the next generation rebel against the be who you are idea of the good life? Are they going to rebel against where things are now? And there's another question here. Where will it all end? Do you think there will be a recoil back to more conservative ideas?
Wonderful questions. First thing I want to say is that we should never expect that everyone is going to be the same. So I talk about the 1950s and 60s, and this is when you don't write your talks down, you miss things out. But one thing I should have mentioned is that not all the youth are going along with this. There are a lot of youth who are looking at this happening saying, well, I don't want anything to do with that. These people are crazy. The way they're living their lives, I want nothing to do with it. So it's not everyone who goes along with it, which means sort of...
Would you even go further in our modern time to say, because of social media, a very small percentage of people with a loud voice, it might look like everyone is going along with whatever the latest thing is, but it might only be a very small percentage. Would you say that's changed?
No, I think there's a lot of truth in that. There's a lot of truth in that. And the worst thing that you can do to understand society is to basically get it from Twitter, because the people who are on Twitter all the time are just very ideologically zealous. They're obsessed with politics and social movements. And they're not normal people. I'm one of them, I completely admit to it. But they're generally not normal people. And so to sort of gauge what the average person thinks from what's being said on Twitter is using a really faulty gauge. So I would agree with that. So when I basically offer what is going to be an answer I think is going to make a lot of you happy, that is not the same as saying that everyone is going to go along. But I do actually think that we are going to get a backlash to a lot of things. I think we're going to get a backlash to secularization. I actually think that you're going to get a lot of people who are going to rediscover Christianity because, I'm a Gen Xer. I was born in 1978. Even kids in my generation grew up going to Sunday school. Like even at my Sunday school, a lot of kids from around the neighborhood went there. And so that in a sense, what it does is it kind of inoculates you from Christianity, where you've been to Sunday school and you kind of think you know it all and it's not for me. It's sort of familiar. I don't want anything to do with it. Whereas you're going to have a whole generation of youngsters, and they're already with us, for whom Christianity is so foreign, it could actually be quite intriguing. It could actually be quite rebellious. And I actually do think... there are a whole bunch of really interesting things happening in America. You've got the Jordan Peterson movement, where Jordan Peterson just becomes this modern prophet, basically teaching, to some extent, some pretty core Christian ideas that basically we're rotten and we need to change. The problem with Peterson is a lot of the time he basically says, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, which is not Christian. But even Peterson himself is moving towards something more Christian-esque or something like that. So I do actually think that a reaction to the very naive individual expressivism, do what you want to do, is actually emerging, particularly, I think, among a lot of men who are starting to feel that the modern society really has no place for them. There's really no job for them. And so I think there are actually a lot of men who are starting to re-emphasize traditional sort of masculine roles. And actually what's happening is that quite conservative forms of Christianity are receiving a revival because people are getting a bit tired of fairly wishy-washy Christianity that hardly seems all that distinguished from the world, and they're going back to much more traditional forms of Christianity. It's certainly happening in America. Whether it's happening to the same extent in Australia is I'm not too sure. But basically, to sort of end this thought, I am a pessimistic optimist, and what that means is I do think things will get better, but not before they get worse. I think humans have a capacity to be rational and to pursue the good for the sake of the good, but I think we are very much irrational and affective creatures, and very often to do the right thing and to see the right thing, we need to put ourselves through hell first. And so I actually do think in many respects things are going to get I'm just going to use the term degenerate in society, but I do think out of that there will be people craving for something different. And you're already seeing glimpses of it again with the Jordan Peterson movement. And the key is, like I said, Christians have to be prepared to be living sort of exemplary lives, to understand their own message, to to be that alternative, because there are alternatives out there. There's another alternative. It's called Islam, and you get a lot of young Aboriginal men, African American men in America. They're not turning to Christianity to get away from a life of ill discipline, excess, self-destruction. They're turning to Islam. So it's up. Humanly speaking, it's up to us.
Stephen, something you said when you sort of took us back to the 60s, and you said young people had this angst and it was in the most prosperous time in human history. I feel like maybe we're there again.
Yeah.
It's a very prosperous time. We're not thinking go and hunt and kill our next meal. We're thinking, what am I going to do when I grow up, sort of thing.
Yep.
We've lost meaning, purpose, that kind of thing. Is that one of the big problems going on at the moment, where we're looking for the cause, the purpose, the meaning in life, and we don't know where to look because it's an endless array of choices?
Well, it's a problem for those who've lost it, but it's an opportunity for those who haven't. And this is the thing, for those, human beings are meaning-seeking creatures. There are all sorts of things that make us unique, but one thing that certainly makes us unique is that we need to have a point to doing things. We don't just want to do things pointlessly. And so whether that's the job that I take, and for a lot of people it's what is the point of life itself, and if they don't feel that question weighing on them when they're young, they'll often feel it weighing on them when they're a bit older, when they sort of become set in a particular lifestyle and they sort of start thinking, well, okay, what's all this about? And so, there probably is an emerging meaning void. And again, people who are talking about men call it they call it the meaning void. The book by Warren Farrell and John Gray, The Boy Crisis, is a brilliant book, and it's basically saying there's a meaning void among men. Maybe there's even a meaning void among women, or maybe women don't have a meaning void. It's just the meaning that they're being given is a false meaning, whereas men are given no meaning from popular culture. Women are given all sorts of meaning. This is what you want to do with your life, women. This is what you can do with your life, women. But arguably, they're all false meanings. They're detached from sort of the biblical understanding of what it is to be a woman. And the same with men. We've sort of lost the biblical understanding of what it is to be a man. And it's all explained pretty early on in Genesis. And all you got to do, let me just be blunt, all you got to do is look in the mirror without your clothes on, and you can sort of figure out a few of the things that God wants us to do with our lives. He wants us to, most of us, there are going to be exceptions, but to think about what I want to do with my life and not think about fatherhood would be a pretty sub-Christian way of thinking about what I'm going to do with my life. Again, for most people. There are exceptions. I don't want to discount that. Is there a meaning void today? Yeah, but that's a meaning opportunity for Christians. So again, as a Christian, every time I see a problem like that, I see it as something that's exciting. I see it as a tremendous opportunity.
We've had so many questions come through, which is fantastic. Then we'll go a couple more. How much do you think the resistance against institutional Christianity is a consequence of Christianity causing or being implicit in causing suffering?
I think some of it is. For example, I think the obvious example is the cover-ups of sexual abuse, probably particularly in the Roman Catholic Church in the early 1990s. But it has subsequently been found that there have been such cover-ups from probably all Christian denominations, for decades. I think that's had a tremendous impact. But again, I'm going to say that that's also been something that's been very exploited by the media and by the enemies of Christianity. And I'm not particularly moved when people tell me that they don't want to be a Christian because they see Christian hypocrites. I'm not moved by that because I don't believe them. I don't believe it because they've also seen plenty of Christians who aren't hypocrites, but they have chosen to focus on that particular example to be the main determining factor in terms of how they receive the gospel of Christ. So, I'm sorry to say I just don't buy that as a very powerful argument. And so, do I think that the sort of the bad things that Christians have done in the past have contributed to cynicism towards Christianity and institutional religion today? Well, yeah, sure. But I think the other side of that is that those have been really amplified and manipulated by a whole generation of journalists, intellectuals, teachers who have been trained in the mindset that emerged in the 1960s and 70s to see Christianity as a kind of oppressive force. So, I mean, nowadays it's trendy just to be a sort of a self-flagellating Christian, but I'm not a self-flagellating Christian. Christianity's done some really great things. It's done some great things. And historically what you often find is that when bad things are done by Christians, like when horrible things are done by Christians like slavery, what you always find is that it's out of the Christian tradition that problem is also resolved. That is what you find.
So on that, how do you walk that balance that, acknowledges the great hurt that many Christians have caused in history, and yet still hold the positive side as well? Surely there's a balance there, right?
Well, it depends on what you mean by balance. I actually think that, again, sort of historically, I think Christianity has worked far more good than it has ill. So in that sense, I'm actually not balanced at all. I actually think Christianity has done much more good, or I would say, let me put it another way, Christians overall, influential Christians have done much more good than they have ill, and I think Christianity is ultimately a force of historical and social good. But again, as Christians, I mean, if Scripture said that once you become a Christian, you will be perfect and you will never do anything horrible to anyone and you will never sin, then that's sufficient to falsify Christianity. But the way I read the New Testament is that it doesn't really say that at all. In fact, it says quite the opposite, which means that when people sin and they call themselves Christians, well, if they are Christians, they're just fulfilling something that was said that was in the New Testament, that we're going to still be struggling with the old person, the old man, in the old-fashioned language. And I love the metaphor that the Apostle Paul uses to describe the death of the old man. He describes it as a crucifixion, and a great. He says that, the old self is crucified, and as one great famous commentary on the book of Romans points out, a crucifixion is not a fast death. It's a very slow, it's a very painful, it's a very agonizing death, and that very often is the experience of the Christian life, the slow, agonizing, painful death of the old self. But the old self is dying, but there are still twitches and flailings of the limb every now and then, and Christians sin, and so it doesn't. That would be my answer to the question, I suppose. And the other thing is, I'm not trying to make anyone happy with my answers. I mean, by balance is sort of make them feel that I've taken their concerns really, really seriously. The thing I actually want to take seriously is historical truth. And if people don't like it, that's just not my problem, And I spend hours and days and years in the archives trying to learn this stuff. And if I come out and say I think Christianity has done a lot more good than it has ill, and I explain why I think that's the case, and they don't like it, I'm not going to try and accommodate them. That's that. It's as simple as that. I mean, I'm not going to lie to them.
There's a sense in which you fight it out on the battlefield of history, and so. Yeah,
exactly. The battle of history, and my position that Christianity has been far better for people than ill, that is not a position that is inconsistent with the idea that Christians have done horrible things. It's perfectly consistent with that position. What it is not consistent with is a position that Christianity has basically done nothing good for anyone. I consider that to be utterly false historically, but it's also, I think, theologically wrong. I think it's theologically wrong. How did we get there? I don't know.
Maybe one more question.
Go two. There's lots of questions.
Oh, there's a lot.
I'll make really, really short answers then. Yes and no. All right.
How do we explain Christian beliefs without people simply thinking that it's just conservative or old-fashioned? Or, like, put it another way, how do we go about convincing people of the gospel in a way that it just isn't overly romantic or nostalgic?
Wonderful.
About the past?
Yeah, wonderful question. I mean, for me, how do you convince people of the gospel? That's a tough. In some ways, it's how do you explain the gospel and how do you convince people of the gospel are two very different questions. And the second is, I mean, how do you explain the gospel? That is in our power to do it. You have to understand exactly what the gospel is. How do you convince people? There's a sense in which you can't. But I think sort of at a bigger picture. And to my mind, the most convincing, the best thing that Christians can do to convince people of the gospel is to live according to it. I think that is really it. And that is not saying that we shouldn't explain the gospel. And that's not sort of always preach the gospel, if necessary, use words. But what I am saying is, you know, as Jesus said, you know, be salt and light. Don't tell people that you are salt or light. Don't tell people that there is salt and light. Be the salt and light, and people will see your good deeds and give praise to your Father in heaven. So in terms of, you know, for a start, it may just be the case that Christian beliefs about, say, gender and sexuality are just inevitably going to sound old-fashioned. And if that is the case, then that is the case. Now, you know, there are some things you can say. You can sort of, what you can do is sort of ask people, okay, well, how has the sexual revolution worked out? You know, basically the sexual revolution says, but you know, as long as there's consent, you can do whatever you like. As long as there is consent, you can do whatever you like. Well, has that worked out, for example, for a lot of young women? So I'm thinking of one particular young woman whose name I've forgotten, who was talking about how she just felt often used and abused in relationships with young men, basically teenage boys. And she consented to all of these encounters. She consented to it, but she just kept feeling used and abused. So in actual fact, what happened was in no way out of step with the 60s sexual revolution. There was consent, but she felt used and abused. And her name will come to me a little bit later. Tame? No, not Grace Tame. It's not her. Someone else. And she said, and they said, well, what do you think is a healthy? We use the word healthy these days. Everything has become medicalized. So what is a healthy sort of sexual relationship? And in fact, she was an advocate of consent. But what so often happens is that people who advocate something actually don't believe what they're advocating. So she was saying, you know, we need consent training, we need consent training, we need consent training. And then they said, well, what does a healthy sexual relationship look like? And what she said was, he really needs to understand who I am. i.e., he needs to be in a genuine, meaningful relationship with me. That's not 60s consent, sexual revolution culture. That's getting closer towards a Christian understanding of sex as something actually very, very meaningful that should exist in a meaningful relationship. So I might approach, if someone said Christianity is old-fashioned, I might say something like what I just said then.
I've got another question here. Much of what you've referred to, so I guess the narrative, has corrected injustices caused by sin, so e.g. sexism. So this person's saying there are some corrections that have happened along the way. How does this reconcile with your quote that worldly morality is inhuman?
Worldly morality is inhuman. I mean, it almost sounds like something I would say, although I didn't say that. But I kind of like it. But I don't think it's. I would say unbiblical morality is unhuman because it's untethered from a Christian understanding of what our nature is. I would basically look. I would want some more detail into exactly what people were getting at. I think the oppression, particularly of women in the past, is greatly exaggerated. I think it's really exaggerated. Like people will say something, well, you know, they couldn't vote 200 years ago. Well, guess what? Neither could men. The overwhelming majority of men could not vote either. In fact, most of human history, the overwhelming majority of men could not vote. They were not taught to read, and they basically worked themselves to death and went to anonymous graves, and that was that. Now, men start to get the vote in the 19th century, and when you look at the big historical picture, in actual fact, women don't get the vote that long after men. Like, women roughly get the vote round about the end of World War II. It's different everywhere, you know. But basically, you know, in England, you don't have full manhood suffrage in England till sort of it's probably round about the turn of the century, World War I. You've still got some men who can't vote. It starts to creep into England in 1832, expands a bit more in 1867 with the Reform Acts, and then it keeps expanding. So if you're talking about sort of the history of humanity over thousands of years, I'm a bit of a creationist, so over thousands of years, basically you've got the overwhelming majority of men, no vote, no vote, no vote, no vote, no vote, no vote. Men get to vote, women get to vote. It's not as horrible as what a lot of people say it is. And there are other things. Why weren't women taught to read? Well, again, men weren't taught to read either for the most part. If you were an aristocratic woman, you would get taught to read, sure. Why weren't women given the same educational opportunities as men? Well, because, again, their life was tethered to their biology. And basically, as soon as they became sexually active, they were going to be having kids and looking after kids. It was just a brute fact of life. The idea that you would educate people to a high degree is very much a product of not even just the Industrial Revolution, but very much a product of the 20th century, and particularly contraceptive technology. So it's very easy to exaggerate the oppression of women in the past, which is not to say that there wasn't oppression, but everyone was oppressed. Like, it was a horrible, horrible period for anyone to be around. So I mean, I want to know what someone meant by, well, you know, what exactly are the advances that we're talking about now? I mean, okay, women go to university now. Okay, sure. But I would say it would have made no sense for most women to go to university 200 years ago. What would be the point of that? Like, again, they're going to, you know, be having children, and they're probably going to die pretty young. Like, I know that sounds really horrible, but history is pretty horrible. And to judge the way people lived based on the way we live in an incredibly technological, prosperous society, it's just not fair. So, yeah, have there been moral advances in the last, you know, talk about moral advances in the last 40 years. Let's say racism. Okay, yeah, sure. I mean, that was spearheaded by Christians for the most part. It was anti-slavery, spearheaded by Christians. Civil rights movement, spearheaded by Christians. So were there Christians opposed to it? Absolutely. But, you know, the Christian forces in favour of it eventually won out. So, yeah, have there been moral advances? Yes. But that, to my mind, confirms, again, just the goodness of Christianity. It's hard actually to think of a moral advance, what I would call a moral advance, that didn't have Christian activists, for the most part, behind it. Off the top of my head, I actually cannot think of one. Universal Declaration of Human Rights, drafted by Christian theologians. Martin Luther King, major agent behind civil rights movement in America. Feminism is a bit tricky because I'm not necessarily convinced that all the things that feminists think are great advances are necessarily great advances. So there's some old-fashioned views for you, but that's just me though. But you know, like I said, Women's Christian Temperance Union in South Australia was responsible for getting South Australian women to vote in the mid-1890s. The Women's Christian Temperance Union. Every movement that you love, you will find Christians spearheading it and very strongly behind it.
I've got another question here. So you've honed in on kind of sexuality,
Yes.
gender. So
Yep.
somebody like Carl Trueman,
Yes.
so he's written a great book, The Rise and Triumph of the
Great
Modern
book.
Self,
Yep.
and he traces why gender and sexuality has become the flashpoint for our culture. But the question here is, what other areas are now culturally drifting away from Christian morality?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are actually a whole bunch of things. I think the reason why people focus on the issue of sex and sexuality and gender is because those things are so powerful in terms of our identity, particularly sex. Like, sex is such a powerful force, which is why you want to be very careful with what your children are exposed to, because it is so powerful. St. Augustine talks about it. It's like, it sort of kindles a fire in you that is very, very difficult to point out. But there are other things. For example, we don't live in a self-restraint culture. And so, the idea of just indulging our appetites is something that is just socially acceptable in a way that no serious Christian would entertain. So just the idea that if I want something, then I have a right to it. That's totally sub-Christian. The idea that life is about the pursuit of happiness, that's totally sub-Christian. The idea that you have a right to be happy, that's the most ridiculous sub-Christian thing, one of the most ridiculous sub-Christian things I've ever heard. In fact, it's actually dangerous, an idea, because if I have a right to be happy, that means if you say something or do something that makes me unhappy, what have you just done? You've violated my rights. And what do you do when someone violates your rights? Who do you call on? The government. The government comes in and says, you can't say that anymore. You can't do that anymore. Enter Victorian laws against religious freedom. That's so other things that are coming, sort of this fetish for happiness, rather than a fetish for I have done my duty as a man, as a father, as a son, as a follower of Jesus. What is the life well lived 70 years ago? A life well lived is that you did your duty to God, country, your family, your community. It was duty-centric. So another very sub-Christian thing about today is the emphasis on rights. The Bible has no emphasis on rights whatsoever. It is not there in the Bible. If anything in the Bible, I barely think you can get this, maybe there's an emphasis on other people's rights, but I would actually say that's barely there either. The emphasis is on other people's well-being, not rights. So our rights-obsessed culture is definitely something that I think is sub-Christian. And that's why Christians also need to be very careful about claiming all this credit for modern human rights. So, I think Christianity really did bring about modern human rights, but they've been horribly abused by another thing that is incredibly sub-Christian, our modern individualism, which doesn't come from Marxism. It doesn't come from sort of the things that conservatives like me like to bash a lot of the time. That actually comes from sort of liberal, democratic, prosperous ways of thinking that basically see the good life as a life where you are free to do whatever you want as long as you're not hurting other people. So here's another thing that I think is sub-Christian, the idea that you can do whatever you want as long as you're not hurting anyone else. I actually think that's totally sub-Christian, because Christ doesn't say, don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you. He says, do for others what you want them to do for you. It's a completely different philosophy. In the parable of the Good Samaritan, in the liberal, democratic, individualist version, the Good Samaritan is good because he walks past the person, and he's good because he's not the one who beat the person up. So he hasn't hurt the person. But in the Christian worldview, no, that the Good Samaritan is good because he actually actively does something for the person. So the liberal mantra of basically do whatever you want as long as you're not hurting other people, that's totally sub-Christian. Christians should have no truck with that.
Well, I think we should probably finish it there. There are a whole bunch of questions, so I want to invite you to continue the conversation with the people you know. Keep talking these things over, exploring them together. But I want to thank you, Stephen, for coming.
Thanks for having me. It's been an honour, and I've really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You'll be able to stay around for a little bit.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
People have got questions, please feel free to come.
Happy, yeah.
Yeah, and thank you for coming. Next week we have Rob Smith. He's a lecturer at SMBC, Sydney Missionary and Bible College, and he'll be coming and helping us think a little bit into something that you alluded to, which is cultural Marxism and critical theory, which is some of the theoretical engine behind a lot of what you've
Definitely.
shared. So, yeah, thank you for coming, and otherwise, hope to see you next week.
Thank you.